The chains of shame. The twin suns of Valoria burned high above the sprawling market of Kowar, casting golden light over a chaotic labyrinth of merchants, thieves, and wanderers. The air was thick with the mingling scents of exotic spices, sizzling meats, and the unwashed bodies of countless beings from across the galaxy. Shouts of traders and the clang of metal on metal filled the space with an unrelenting symphony of commerce, barter, and exploitation. Among the endless rows of stalls and hagglers, a spectacle was unfolding, one that carried the bitter stench of cruelty and suffering. At the heart of the market, a rusted iron cage stood elevated on a wooden platform, its bars slick with grime and the remnants of previous occupants' despair. The imprisoned figure within was a woman, or at least something that resembled one to the untrained eye of the crowd. Her skin, once a soft pearlescent hue that shimmered like moonlight, was now dulled by streaks of dirt and dried blood. Her silver-blue hair was tangled and matted, draping over her face as she crouched in the corner, trying to make herself small, trying to disappear. But no amount of shrinking could shield her from the piercing stares of those who gawked at her, some with amusement, others with contempt. A corpulent slaver with mottled orange skin and 3 blackened tusks protruding from his lower jaw stood beside the cage, his beady eyes gleaming with the thrill of the sale. His voice, thick with malice, cut through the din of the marketplace. "Look here, fine people of Kowar. Behold this wretched creature. So lowly, so pathetic, even her own kind cast her aside. But do not be fooled by her pitiful state," he sneered, gripping the bars of the cage and shaking them for effect. "Beneath the filth, she is worth something, to the right buyer. A servant, a pet, a plaything. Who among you will take her?" Laughter rippled through the crowd. Some barked crude jokes, others whispered to one another, weighing the worth of such a creature. But the woman in the cage did not flinch. She did not move. This was not the first time she had suffered such humiliation, nor would it be her last if fate continued to be unkind. The slaver reached into the cage with a hooked cane, yanking her forward so violently that her frail body collapsed against the iron bars. A reptilian merchant with emerald green scales resting on the hilt of a dagger strapped to his belt eyed her critically. "She looks frail," he hissed. "How much before she keels over?" The slaver's grin widened. "Ah, but that is the beauty of it. A creature who has suffered knows her place, knows how to obey. She has been broken, and yet she still breathes. That means she is strong enough to endure whatever you desire." Another merchant, a bulbous amphibian with translucent skin pulsing with an eerie bioluminescence, stepped forward, his webbed fingers tapping against his chin. "And if she is worthless, what assurance do we have that she will not expire the moment she is put to work?" The slaver chuckled darkly. "Ah, but that is why I offer a discount." He gestured grandly, as if bestowing a great gift upon the assembled crowd. "She is a liability to me, a burden. So I ask you all, who will take this filth off my hands?" There was a pause, a moment of collective hesitation. The gathered traders were not moved by pity, nor were they repulsed by the cruelty of the display. They simply assessed her value as they would a damaged good, calculating, measuring, deciding whether the risk outweighed the reward. And then a voice broke through the murmurs. "I will take her." The words were not shouted, nor did they carry the smug assurance of one looking to bargain. They were spoken with quiet certainty, yet they sliced through the noise like a blade. The crowd parted slightly, revealing the man who had spoken. He was not the sort one would expect to find in a place like Kowar's market. He lacked the hunched posture of a scavenger, the calculating gaze of a merchant, or the calloused hands of a laborer. Instead, he carried himself with a quiet strength, a presence that seemed to demand attention without effort. His face was partially concealed beneath the hood of a well-worn cloak, but the sharpness of his jawline and the intensity of his gaze were visible beneath the shadows. The slaver's eyes narrowed as he examined the man. "And what would you do with her, traveler?" he asked, suspicion creeping into his voice. The man did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the woman in the cage. Her head was still bowed, her shoulders slumped in a posture of learned helplessness. But for a fleeting moment, she lifted her eyes to meet his. And what he saw there stirred something deep within him. Not just pain, not just resignation. There was defiance, buried beneath layers of suffering, a spark that had not yet been extinguished. The slaver, sensing an opportunity to drive up the price, let out a mocking laugh. "Ah, I see. You think she is more than she appears. A noble soul trapped in unfortunate circumstances, perhaps. How sentimental." He smirked, crossing his thick arms over his chest. "Fine, make me an offer. She is yours, if you can pay." The man reached into the folds of his cloak and produced a small pouch, tossing it to the slaver with a casual flick of his wrist. The heavy sound of clinking credits silenced the onlookers. The slaver caught it, opened it, and let out a low whistle. A generous sum for something so broken, he mused, before grinning wide. "But far be it from me to refuse a fool's coin. She is yours." With a creak of rusted metal, the cage door was wrenched open. The woman made no move to step forward. The weight of years in captivity had trained her to expect another blow, another command, another cruel jest. But none came. Instead, the man knelt, reaching out his hand. "Come," he said, his voice steady but gentle. She hesitated. Trust was a foreign thing, an unknown currency. And yet there was something in his voice, something she had not heard in a long time. Not pity, not condescension. Value. With a trembling hand, she reached out and took his. And in that moment, her world shifted. The shame of the market, the taunts of the traders, the filth that clung to her skin, none of it mattered anymore. Because for the first time in a long time, she was no longer just a thing to be sold. She was something more. Someone. The chains began to break. The crowd barely paid attention as the man helped the alien woman from the cage. Once the spectacle was over, the market returned to its usual rhythm, haggling, trading, and the exchange of lives as commodities. To them, she was just another creature, another thing that had been bought and sold. But to her, this moment was everything. Her legs trembled as they touched solid ground. She had spent so long in confinement that standing upright felt unnatural. The dried, dusty air of Kowar burned her lungs, and her vision blurred from dehydration. The weight of her tattered rags hung loosely around her thin frame, barely offering protection from the harsh winds that kicked up sand and debris around her. Yet, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she was no longer behind iron bars. The man who had purchased her stood beside her, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hood. His grip on her wrist was firm, but not cruel, a stark contrast to the slaver's iron grasp. It was a strange sensation, this feeling of being touched without violence. She could not decide whether to recoil or collapse into the strange warmth of it. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice cutting through the murmur of the market. She didn't respond immediately. She wasn't sure if she could. Her body had long since stopped feeling like her own, reduced to nothing more than an object of suffering. But when she tried to take a step, her legs buckled, and she fell forward. Without hesitation, the man caught her. His arms wrapped around her, steadying her before she could hit the ground. The sudden contact sent a jolt through her system, her body bracing for pain that never came. The crowd's lingering gazes turned to quiet amusement. A few traders chuckled. "She's not worth the credits, stranger," someone called. "Broken merchandise." The man ignored them. He adjusted his grip, one arm now supporting her weight. "We need to leave," he said, more to himself than to her. He turned, leading her through the winding paths of the market. She tried to understand what was happening. No one had ever bought her for anything other than use, to squeeze whatever little value she had left until she could give no more. And yet this man had done nothing but support her, guide her. But why? An unfamiliar freedom. As they left the heart of the market, The suffocating press of bodies gave way to quieter alleyways. The sandstone buildings of Kowar loomed above them, their surfaces cracked and worn by time. Rusted metal doors and faded banners hinted at the planet's better days, days long gone. The farther they walked, the quieter it became. The sounds of the marketplace faded behind them, replaced by the occasional gust of wind and the scuttling of unseen creatures in the shadows. Finally, they stopped beside an old speeder, a battered vehicle covered in dust from years of travel. The man let go of her wrist, giving her a moment to find her balance on her own. "You need water," he said, moving to a compartment at the side of the speeder. He retrieved a metal canister and held it out to her. "Drink." She hesitated. The act of being offered something without force or condition felt alien to her. She stared at the canister, expecting a command, a punishment if she did not obey quickly enough. He seemed to understand her hesitation. "It's not poisoned," he said, his tone softer now. "I wouldn't have wasted my credits if I wanted you dead." That was true. Slowly, cautiously, she reached for the canister. Her fingers trembled as she unscrewed the cap and lifted it to her lips. The moment the water touched her tongue, she nearly choked. It was clean, cool. Unlike the stale, filthy liquid she had been given in captivity, it tasted of life. She drank greedily, water dripping down her chin as she gulped it down. Her body craved it more than air, but before she could drain the entire canister, a firm but gentle hand covered hers. "Not too fast," the man warned. "You'll make yourself sick." She pulled the canister away, her breathing heavy, her heart pounding. For a moment, there was silence between them. She realized, now that she was outside of the cage, that she had no idea what came next. Her freedom, if this was even what it was, felt empty. A name lost to time. The man leaned against the speeder, watching her with an expression she could not read. His face was partially hidden beneath the hood of his cloak, but his eyes were sharp, calculating yet not unkind. "You don't have to be afraid," he said. She had no response to that. Fear was all she had ever known. After a pause, he asked, "What's your name?" The question struck her like a physical blow. A name. Did she still have one? There had been something, long ago, before the cages, before the slavers, a sound that had once belonged to her, but it was buried beneath years of being called thing, merchandise, waste. Her throat tightened. She tried to speak, but the words felt foreign, stuck in the back of her mind like a half-forgotten dream. The man watched her struggle but did not press her. He exhaled through his nose and crossed his arms. "I suppose it doesn't matter," he said. "Not right now, anyway." He turned and opened the speeder's door. "We need to get moving. There are people here who won't like that I took you from the market." That she understood. Slavers did not take kindly to losing their property. Still, she hesitated. The man noticed. He tilted his head slightly, studying her with something resembling patience. "You can stay here," he said, motioning to the empty street. "Go where you want. But if you come with me, you leave all of this behind." He gestured back toward the market, toward the world that had broken her. She looked over her shoulder. The streets were emptier here, but not safe. She knew what happened to creatures like her when left on their own. The world outside the cage was no more merciful than the one within it. She turned back to him. His hand rested on the edge of the speeder's door, waiting, not commanding, not demanding, offering. She took a step forward, then another. She climbed into the speeder. As the door shut behind her, she did not know where they were going. She did not know why this man had saved her. But for the first time in years, she had made a choice, and that perhaps was the first step toward something she had long believed impossible. A life. The long road to freedom. The hum of the speeder's engine filled the silence between them as it kicked up a trail of dust through the wastelands beyond Kowar. The twin suns of Valoria hung low on the horizon, bathing the cracked earth in hues of deep amber and fading gold. The heat of the day was beginning to wane, but the air still carried the sharp sting of dust and dryness. She sat in the passenger seat, her hands resting limply in her lap. Every movement of the speeder jolted her frail body, and each bump on the uneven terrain sent sharp pains through her starved muscles. Yet she remained silent, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The man, her so-called savior, kept his eyes on the path ahead. He hadn't spoken since they left the market, and she found herself both grateful for and unsettled by the quiet. She had spent so long surrounded by cruelty, by slavers barking orders and traders mocking her, that the absence of those things felt unnatural. Who was he? And why had he done this? She had asked herself the same questions over and over since stepping into the speeder, but no answer came. She had long since stopped believing in kindness, and she did not dare hope that he was anything more than another opportunist who simply had yet to reveal his intentions. The road stretched endlessly ahead, barren and dry. No trees, no rivers, no signs of life, just the desolation of Valoria's wastelands. A fitting place for someone like her, she supposed. Finally, the man spoke. "You haven't asked where we're going." His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of an unspoken challenge, as if he expected her to question him. She did not. She did not care. She turned her head slightly, not looking at him, but acknowledging his words. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was hoarse from disuse. "Does it matter?" He exhaled through his nose, as if considering her response. "To most it would. I am not most." He glanced at her, and for the first time, she met his eyes. They were sharp, piercing, but not unkind. They carried the weight of a man who had seen things, survived things. "I suppose you aren't," he admitted. Silence returned. The wastelands stretched on, a name long forgotten. He reached into a compartment near the dashboard and pulled out another water canister, handing it to her without looking. She hesitated. "Drink," he said. "You need it." A flicker of something, distrust, perhaps, flashed in her eyes. But she took it anyway, unscrewing the lid with shaky fingers. This time, she drank slower, letting the cool liquid soothe the rawness of her throat. As she did, he spoke again. "If you won't tell me your name, I'll have to call you something." She lowered the canister. "Why?" "Because I don't intend to call you girl for the rest of this journey." She looked at him, skeptical. "And what will you call me?" He tapped his fingers on the steering controls. "Something strong." She scoffed softly, a humorless sound. "I am not strong." The man's hands tightened slightly around the controls, and for the first time, his tone shifted, something firm, almost sharp. "You are alive. That is enough." She didn't respond. Names had never mattered to the people who had owned her. To them, she was nothing but a thing, a product to be bought and sold. But this man, he was different. She didn't understand him yet, and that terrified her more than anything. The weight of freedom. The speeder's pace slowed as they approached a towering ridge of jagged rock formations, their sharp edges carved by centuries of windstorms. Beyond them, a narrow path snaked through the cliffs, leading into the heart of Valoria's wastelands. She studied the landscape with a quiet curiosity. This was unfamiliar terrain, far beyond the outskirts of Kowar where the slavers did business. "Where are we going?" she finally asked. The man kept his eyes ahead. "Somewhere safe." She frowned. The concept of safe was foreign to her. "There is no such thing," she muttered. He didn't argue, but his grip tightened slightly on the steering controls. For miles, they traveled in silence, weaving through the rocky terrain. The temperature dropped as night began to settle over the wastelands, casting long shadows across the jagged cliffs. Finally, the man veered the speeder off the main path, driving it toward what looked like nothing more than a cluster of boulders. But as they drew closer, she realized that nestled between the rocks was a hidden passage, barely wide enough for the vehicle to slip through. They entered the crevice, the walls of the canyon rising high on either side, swallowing them in darkness. The temperature dropped further, and the sounds of the outside world faded, leaving only the low hum of the speeder's engine. And then they emerged into a hidden valley. Her breath caught. It was nothing like Kowar. Towering cliffs surrounded the valley, sheltering it from the harsh winds of the wastelands. A small river cut through the land, its water shimmering beneath the faint light of the rising moons. Strange flora grew in patches along the banks, plants she had never seen before, their bioluminescent leaves pulsing faintly in the darkness. A small structure, made of salvaged metal and stone, stood near the river's edge. It was no palace, no grand estate, but it was a home. The speeder came to a stop. The man climbed out first, stretching his shoulders before walking to the other side and opening her door. She hesitated again. The man sighed. "You can stay in the speeder if you want, but it's warmer inside." She stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she stepped out. The air smelled different here, cleaner, free of the filth and decay of Kowar. She followed him toward the small dwelling. The door slid open with a mechanical hiss, revealing the modest interior. A cot pushed against one wall, a simple workbench with scattered tools, and a small cooking station. It was plain, simple, but it was not a cage. The man stepped inside and gestured toward the cot. "You need rest." She didn't move. He exhaled. "Look, I don't know what you've been through, but you are safe here." He hesitated. For now, at least. Safe. The word was meaningless to her, but exhaustion weighed heavily on her body, and for the first time in years, there was no immediate threat. Slowly, she walked to the cot and sat down. She did not thank him. She did not trust him. But she was here. For now, that was enough. The man turned away, removing his cloak and setting it aside. The firelight flickered across his features, and she caught her first real glimpse of him. A scar ran from his temple down to his jawline, partially hidden beneath stubble. His clothing was worn but well kept, the kind of gear used by travelers who had no true home. And his eyes, those piercing eyes, held something she did not expect. Understanding. She turned away, lying down on the cot. For the first time in a long time, she closed her eyes. She did not expect to sleep. And yet, sleep found her.